Do you find yourself waking up each day unsure of where our world is heading?
Scrolling in disbelief at images of war, heartache, and devastation.
The order of things we thought we knew is being turned on its head.
Leaving us wondering, where is this all heading and where will it end? As followers of Jesus, we know it's not up to us to save the world, and that's a very good thing. Ultimately, we know how the story ends. Love wins, the last shall be first, and justice will prevail. But what does that mean for the here and now, in this anxious moment in our world?
At Micah, we want to keep hope alive. We believe in a call to justice that unites us. We see it as our immense privilege to help the Australian Church come together on this one thing, to remind our leaders that we are blessed to be a blessing, that as a wealthy nation, we have the incredible opportunity to love our neighbours well.
So what does that look like? For starters, it requires a clear-eyed view of the world as it is. Our nation's politicians aren't running a church or a charity. It's their job to seek the best outcomes for their constituents and our nation, and right now they are under immense pressure.
We know Australia faces its own significant challenges because our church's domestic Christian agencies are on the front lines responding. From the cost of living challenges making it hard for families to afford even the basics, to the ongoing journey of reconciliation and unmet promises to close the gap for our incredibly resilient yet strained First Nations people, to increasingly harsh floods, droughts, fires, and rains.
Of course, it's not just Australia. Increasingly anxious populations worldwide are voting leaders in and out at record rates. In response, nations are turning inward, questioning their responsibility beyond their borders. What's happening in the US is the obvious example. Instead of celebrating all that aid has achieved since its inception after the Second World War, both for those that it has helped and for America's global reputation, a tiny handful of questionable projects have been relentlessly spotlighted. And what could have been a fair, justified review of aid spending has instead spiraled into the most rapid and drastic cuts in history, wiping out the majority of US aid programs overnight with devastating consequences.
Against this backdrop, it's crucial to remind ourselves and others what aid is truly about and what it achieves. Here's what it looks like in real terms. Aid is Australian medical teams rapidly deployed to Vanuatu after recent earthquakes. Aid is Australia's Papua New Guinea education program, which in just 5 years trained over 6,400 teachers and improved education outcomes for 360,000 children. Aid is support for mothers and their children fleeing conflicts in Ukraine, Sudan, and Gaza.
Aid is Australia playing its part to combat global pandemics like Ebola, bird flu, Mpox, and of course whatever comes next after COVID-19. Aid is Vietnam and South Korea, once ravaged by war, now some of Australia's strongest trading partners. Aid is malaria cases falling globally from the Solomon Islands to sub-Saharan Africa by 41% between 2000 and 2015. Aid is the number of children who die under the age of 5 dropping by 60% between 1990 and 2020.
So yes, aid is what you've always thought it was: humanitarian assistance, education, and health. But it's also so much more, like investments in trade infrastructure, cybersecurity, anti-trafficking, and combating extremism and disinformation.
So what happens when we don't fund aid? Or worse, when we rapidly withdraw it like we've seen in the US? Of course, there are the immediate, devastating human stories that we're hearing, like reports of mothers forced to beg in Kenya for the medications they were on to keep them from passing HIV onto their newborns. And famine-stricken communities in war-torn Sudan who are relying on emergency food kitchens, 80% of which have now been forced to close.
But history warns us of even greater upheavals ahead, ones we might not even see coming. We don't have to look far back to see what happened the last time the world retreated from international cooperation and support. After the Cold War, Western governments reduced aid budgets, thinking they were no longer in need. The result? The world did not become safer. In fact, it was far from it. Within a few years, the 1994 Rwandan genocide unfolded with little intervention. The Taliban took control of Afghanistan, providing safe haven for extremists. The Asian financial crisis pushed millions into poverty. Then came 9/11 and the decades-long wars that followed in the Middle East.
The lesson? When we pull back from supporting the most vulnerable, instability, conflict, and extremism fill the void. We've seen it before, and we've never been closer to that kind of instability arriving in our own region. The bottom line, despite our best wishes sometimes that it weren't the case, our world is deeply connected, and what happens in one part of the body affects the whole.
As Christians, we know Jesus' call is not just to care for our own tribe, but to a worldview that is by nature internationalist, one that transcends national and cultural boundaries to seek the flourishing of all people and creation. And we shouldn't be surprised that loving our neighbor is not just a nice idea, but a God-given strategy that truly works, bringing greater connection, peace, and shared prosperity. So if it falls to us to remind our communities and leaders of this, then we must be ready and willing to do so.
Which brings us to Australia's aid contribution. So how much do you think we really spend on aid? You might be surprised. It's just 0.68% of our federal budget. It was nearly twice this under John Howard, then Rudd and Gillard, and for years Australia had bipartisan support for a strong aid program. And just as a quick aside, if you've been someone who has advocated for aid for a while, we don't want you to get confused with another number often used in these discussions. That is the percentage of aid we give relative to our national wealth, or our gross national income, GNI, also known as the generosity indicator. The global target there was always for wealthy nations to reach 0.7% of GNI for aid, but that goal has long since faded in Australia. In fact, right now we sit at just 0.19% of GNI, ranking us near the bottom among other wealthy nations.
So how did this happen? A decade ago, Australian aid was dramatically reduced as part of our own major review and restructure, making it already far leaner and more regionally focused than many other nations like the US and UK who are now reviewing their aid programs. And since then, there's been some good news though. The Morrison government temporarily boosted aid during COVID, and Albanese government then further invested to stabilize it, not to dramatically rebuild it, but to simply ensure it wasn't falling further. Micah and the church campaigned for and strongly welcomed both of these steps, while recognizing there is still such a long way to go.
So where to from here? Political research shows that when Australians learn the facts, just how little we actually spend on aid, two things happen. Firstly, they're surprised. Many are even embarrassed, and there's net positive support for restoring aid. Secondly, they realise aid isn't coming at the cost of Australians, especially those doing it tough, because more than 99% of our budget is still spent on ourselves. That's why we still believe in an aid program that brings us back to 1% of the federal budget. Not an impossible goal, just what we believe is right and smart. We want to hold the line for Australia to remain a generous, outward-focused nation, especially at a time when political leaders most feel the pressure to turn inward.
And we also know that aid is only part of the answer. We don't pretend that aid is a silver bullet for all the world's ills. That would be as unwise as it would be simplistic. And as followers of Jesus, we know that no amount of aid can replace God's call on our lives and on the church to be God's hands and feet in a hurting world, to be peacemakers, to hunger and thirst for righteousness, and to love not just in words, but in action and truth.
But we also believe that the actions of our government towards our neighbours matter. They say something about the soul of our nation. And so at Micah, we pray, act, and advocate for an Australia that acts justly and shows mercy to our neighbours near and far. And we believe that when the church speaks with a prophetic voice, the actions of a nation can change. If you believe this too, would you join us in adding your voice to ensure our nation's leaders know Australian Christians support Australian aid?